Have you ever stopped to think about the history of your favorite brands? Probably not, right? Turns out Coca-Cola, the soft drinks behemoth which sells products in virtually every country on Earth, has a pretty dark secret, but you can't really blame them for it, to be fair. The brand, known to billions around the world, is actually the owner of Fanta, which was the personal favorite of one Adolf Hitler, arguably the worst man in history. So hit like, subscribe, and settle in as we take you through the story of Hitler and Coca-Cola Company. You might think that at the end of a long day oppressing Europe's minorities, a man like Adolf Hitler would enjoy nothing better than to kick back with a nice glass of wine, perhaps a whiskey if he's had a particularly productive day fighting on two fronts. However, you might be shocked to learn that Der Führer was actually teetotal. The man didn't drink at all. Must have been tough not being able to take the edge off of that particular burden of being Adolf Hitler. Instead, Hitler found solace in one of the most popular drinks of the past 85 years, Fanta. Part of the Coca-Cola family, Fanta was first introduced to the general public in 1940, right in the midst of Hitler's European power grab. I mean, talk about timing, right? And it turns out that war was quite a profitable time for the soft drinks maker, as it became an instant hit with Hitler and his sycophants. The history of the company is fascinating, complex, and often controversial. I mean, anything linked to one of the darkest periods in human history is going to be, of course. The brainchild of German businessman Max Keith, Fanta was hugely popular, but we need to step back in time a decade or so to truly understand why it was initially made and why it became the overnight sensation with the Nazis that it did. Coca-Cola had established itself in Germany back in the late 20s, but the Great Depression threatened to ruin it all. Thankfully for the Americans, the global economic downturn had no bearing whatsoever on the company, and Keith, in his position as head of Coca-Cola GmbH, turned the German subsidiary into one of the biggest success stories of 1930s Europe. During the 1930s, Coca-Cola was everywhere and was front and center in early Nazi Germany. With the rise of the now-defunct party in the early 30s, sales skyrocketed. Keith's Coca-Cola GmbH had a close relationship with Nazi higher-ups, and although it was strictly business-oriented, the company prospered. The Nazi Party had a strict, aggressive economic policy which favored domestic products, and Keith, as head of the company, saw an opportunity. He positioned Coca-Cola to be one of the biggest sponsors of the 1936 Olympics, an official drink of the tournament, which was famously used by Hitler for propaganda reasons, although a certain Jesse Owens would ruin that particular games for him. The company would also sponsor other Nazi events during the 1930s, and being the master marketer he was, Keith made sure Coca-Cola's marketing fit with the themes of the Nazi Party. He also made sure the brand's marketing remained apolitical, whilst obviously making sure to not criticize Hitler and his cronies. Keith was running a very fine line between support of the Nazis and remaining an anti-Nazi at heart. But with the onset of war at the end of the decade, Coca-Cola was in trouble and Keith was forced to pivot. September 1939 brought about a new era in Europe as the Nazis entered Poland. That brought with it its own set of problems for the people of Central Europe. One of them, albeit a minor problem in the grand scheme of things, was the limited supply of Coca-Cola as trade restrictions imposed by the Allies became tighter. It became more and more difficult for Keith and his business associates to get their hands on key ingredients such as coca leaf extract, caffeine, and caramel coloring. And when the U.S. entered the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, these ingredients essentially became gold dust. Keith, quite fortunately for himself and the Coca-Cola Company, had forged some high-level contacts in the Nazi Party throughout the 30s, and men like Franz von Papen, former Chancellor of the Reich, and Fritz Todt, founder of military engineering group organization Todt, were there to assist when Keith needed them most. Throughout the 30s, both von Papen and Todt had been instrumental in ensuring that Keith had everything he needed to be able to keep up his vast Coca-Cola empire and gave him everything he needed to keep it growing. They were both on hand to support Keith in his next venture. With this backing and the now impossible task of producing Coca-Cola in Germany, Keith pitched the idea of a completely new drink, using only ingredients available in the German Reich, and Fanta was born. He scrambled to formulate his new drink from ingredients which could be readily sourced within Nazi-controlled areas. He figured out that the Hitler regime had easy access to ingredients such as whey, apple pomace, beet sugar, and plenty of fruit scraps. After an initial period of trial and error, he was able to produce a new drink with a golden orange color, which, despite tasting slightly sour at the beginning, had plenty of promise. A couple of tweaks here and there, and the soft drink we now know as Fanta was introduced to the German-speaking world. But how did the drink get its distinctive name? Well, as it happens, the German word for imagination is fantasy, and with Keith having to think outside the box to produce the drink, it was an obvious choice. As legend has it, one of Keith's salesmen shortened it to Fanta in a meeting, and the name just stuck. Other sources claim the name came from a competition within the GmbH offices. Fanta enjoyed unrivaled early success in Nazi Germany and actually benefited from the war in many ways. Despite the fact there was a war on, the company was one of very few producers of soft drinks, and it didn't do any harm at all that it tasted great. People throughout the Reich, both military and civilian, were being subjected to strict rationing, except where Fanta was concerned. As such, the drink became the perfect tool for Nazi propaganda minister Josef Goebbels, who lauded the fact that a German product such as Fanta was so widely available during these testing times. Obviously, he didn't shout about the fact that its success was due to the fact that no one could get their hands on Coca-Cola. In fact, the drink was so popular that housewives would use it for cooking and baking, further cementing its place in the German pantry. So how was this behemoth of German innovation perceived by the omnipotent Hitler in the halls of the Reichstag? We know Hitler was teetotal, and that he was also a big fan of German products, so it's likely Fanta was very popular with the Führer himself. We know for a fact it was consumed by the tankload by German soldiers and Nazi higher-ups, so it is very unlikely society itself would have been given unprecedented access to it had Hitler not been on board. As the war progressed, people were relying on the drink more and more. It was front and center at Nazi events and was becoming synonymous with the regime. However, Keith could almost certainly see the writing on the wall for the Nazis, as he maintained his position of keeping Fanta as far away from politics as possible, despite its obvious association with the Nazis. The Coca-Cola GmbH boss had been provided with slave labor for the majority of the war, but by all accounts, he was the model boss. Short of actively moving Jews out of Germany a la Oskar Schindler, it is believed that he was warm-hearted with his workers, and they did not suffer. Actually, after the war, Keith was interrogated by the Allies for collaboration, but some of his slave laborers came to his defense, informing authorities that he had, in fact, treated them well and fed them appropriately. As 1945 approached, Coca-Cola GmbH was incredibly still standing, as all around it was crumbling. Of course, the Americans had lost direct control over their German subsidiary, but once the war ended, they promptly took control of all German businesses. This was a nervy time for Keith, who was worried about what would happen to his invention, and ultimately, as the raw materials for Coca-Cola were once again made available in Germany after the war, Keith's baby was discontinued. This wasn't a reflection on Keith, nor the drink he had invented. It was simply down to the fact that Coca-Cola, a much more recognizable global brand, was now available again. Of course, any brand which was used and promoted by the Nazis will always court controversy. I mean, we've all heard those stories of Hugo Boss kidding out the SS, which just so happened to be true. However, Fanta was simply a product of its environment, and Keith himself always went out of his way to protect the brand and limit any association with the Nazi Party. This was very difficult under Nazi rule, and there was always going to be some sort of collaboration, no matter how much Keith tried to avoid it. As the decades have worn on after World War II, there has been a certain level of myth perpetuated around the story of Fanta and the extent of their working relationship with the Nazi Party. There are always those who will say we should never let the truth get in the way of a good story, but that just adds to the myth. The fact of the matter is that Fanta and GmbH were not created explicitly to aid the Nazi regime. It was simply born out of opportunism in the face of adversity. The brand was never a Nazi invention, as much as some will try to tell you that it was. We should probably paint the product as a sort of wartime strategy to ensure the survival of Coca-Cola GmbH. Yes, the company operated and received favor from Nazi rule and, for the most part, flourished during the war, but GmbH didn't invade Poland, and they probably shouldn't be treated as if they did. They were simply doing what they had to in order to survive. Time hasn't been kind to Max Keith either. As the years have worn on, the German businessman has been painted in a less than flattering light for his association with Nazi higher-ups. This, of course, was always going to happen. But to dispel another rumor, Keith was never a member of the Nazi Party, and even refused to join the party on multiple occasions, even in the face of mounting pressure. So what is the legacy of Fanta, and is it a fair one? The creation of Fanta in Germany, with so much going on around it and during a time of massive upheaval, is really a story like no other. Honestly, it should be studied as a fantastic example of business adaptability in extreme conditions. What Max Keith was able to do? Keep his head whilst all around him were losing theirs, both figuratively and literally, is testament to the man. His skills as a high-level negotiator, politician, and humanitarian should not be underestimated either. Keith was able to play the Nazis whilst simultaneously creating a global brand which is still relevant almost 100 years later. Whilst Coca-Cola's wartime history remains somewhat stained, Fanta itself has moved on from its origins and has become one of the most recognizable and beloved international soft drinks. Thanks for listening today, guys, and remember to tune in again next time when we will be discussing lots more interesting bits and pieces from history.